The day Bessie Redmond decided to cook one meal for the dusty, half-starved cowboy slumped against her porch railing was the day her entire life changed, though she would not understand that for several weeks, and by then it was far too late to do anything about it. The year was 1873, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the very edge of civilization like a splinter on the thumb of the frontier. The cattle trails ran thick through that country, and the men who drove the Longhorns north from Texas arrived in Caldwell looking like something the land itself had chewed up and spit out. They were sunburned and hollow-eyed, their boots cracked and their coats stiff with trail dust, and they filled the saloons on a Saturday night with a kind of desperate noise that made the proper residents of Caldwell lock their shutters and pray the weekend would pass quickly. Bessie Redmond was 24 years old that autumn, and she was not a woman who locked her shutters easily. She had come to Caldwell 2 years prior from a small town in Ohio, following her Uncle Franklin, who had staked a claim on 40 acres of shortgrass prairie just south of the main road and built a frame house with enough rooms to feel optimistic about. Franklin had died of a fever in the spring of 1872, leaving Bessie the house, the land, a milk cow named Daisy, 8 laying hens, and a vegetable garden that she had expanded considerably through sheer stubbornness and a natural talent for coaxing things out of the ground. She was not wealthy, but she was not desperate either. She sold eggs to the general store owned by Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove, traded butter for dry goods, and took in mending when the season turned cold and the ranch wives had more work than hands. She had honey-colored hair that she kept pinned severely at the back of her neck, because she had learned early that a woman living alone in cattle country did not benefit from being noticed too freely. She had sharp gray eyes and a straight spine, and a jaw that the local minister, Reverend Alcott, had once described as determined, which she took as a compliment though he had not entirely meant it that way. The morning Harvey Ellsworth appeared on her porch, it had been raining for 3 days straight, the kind of low, gray October rain that turned the road through Caldwell into a river of reddish mud and made every living creature miserable. Bessie had been up since before dawn making bread, and the smell of it had rolled out through the kitchen window and across the yard with considerable authority. She heard the sound before she saw him, a low thump against the porch post, the kind of sound a man makes when his legs have simply decided they are finished for the day. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door, and there he was. He was sitting with his back against the post and his long legs stretched out in front of him, his hat tipped over his face against the drizzle, his coat soaked through to the lining. He was lean in the particular way that trail cowboys were lean, like leather that had been stretched and dried in the sun, all angles and patience. His boots were worn down to almost nothing on the left heel. His horse, a roan mare with a patient expression, stood at the hitching post with her head hung low in the rain. Bessie stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment. "You are on my porch," she said. He pushed the hat back from his face and looked up at her. He had dark eyes, nearly black, and a 3-week beard, and a cut above his left eyebrow that had been clumsily bandaged with a piece of shirt cloth. He looked at her steadily, the way a man looks when he is too tired to be anything other than honest. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "I believe I am." "Are you injured?" "Not mortally." She looked at the bandage. "That cut needs proper attention. I expect you're right about that." She looked at him a moment longer, then at his horse, then back at him. "Put your horse in the barn. There's hay and a water trough. Then come to the back door." She paused. "I will feed you once. I am not running a boarding house." "No, ma'am," he said, getting to his feet with the slow deliberateness of a man whose body was protesting every instruction he gave it. "I wouldn't expect that." She went back inside and put another plate on the kitchen table, telling herself it was simple Christian charity, nothing more. His name was Harvey Ellsworth, and he was 27 years old, born in a small county in Missouri to a farm family that had been scattered by the war and the years that followed it. He had been 15 when the war ended, and his father came home a different man than the one who had left. And by the time Harvey was 18, he had already understood that Missouri held nothing for him, that the open country to the west did not hold better. He had drifted south and then west, learning cattle work the hard way, which was the only way it was really learned. And by the time he arrived in Caldwell, he had been trailing longhorns for 8 years and could do most things a man needed to do with a rope, a horse, and very little else. He came through the back door and stood in the kitchen, and looked at the bread on the table and the pot of bean soup on the iron stove and the neat white curtains on the windows, as though he had stumbled into a painting of something he had nearly forgotten existed. Bessie cleaned the cut above his eyebrow with carbolic and rebandaged it with proper linen while he sat in the chair by the stove and tried not to show how much it stung. She worked quickly and precisely, the way a woman works when she has decided to do a thing and intends to do it correctly regardless of how she feels about the necessity. "How did you get this?" she asked. "Disagreement with a fence post," he said. She gave him a look that said she was not entirely deceived by this explanation, but that she was not going to pursue it, and tied off the bandage with a firm little knot. He ate 2 bowls of soup and 3 thick slices of bread with butter, and he ate quietly, without the noisy consumption that characterized most of the men who came off the trail. He said thank you when she put the bread in front of him, and he said it again when she refilled his coffee, and she noticed both times because manners were not a reliable feature of the men who passed through Caldwell. "Where are you headed?" she asked, sitting across from him with her own bowl of soup. "Nowhere particular," he said. "The drive's done. Herd sold off in Abilene 3 weeks ago. I was riding south to see about work on one of the ranches down near the Cimarron. The big spreads are mostly Cheyenne land," she said. "Or they were not long ago." She said it plainly without editorializing, but the weight of it sat in the room between them for a moment. Harvey looked at his coffee cup. "Yes," he said, "I know that. Are you a decent man, Mr. Ellsworth?" He looked up. "I try to be." That is either a very honest answer or a very careful one. "Might be both," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it. She stood and cleared the bowls. "The rain won't let up before evening. You can sleep in the barn if you need to, but come morning I expect you'll move on." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "And thank you for the meal. I mean that sincerely. It's the finest thing I've eaten since I can remember." She did not look at him when he said it, but she felt the words settle somewhere in her chest with a warmth she did not entirely approve of. Harvey spent the night in the barn and was up before dawn, and when Bessie came out in the gray morning to tend to the milk cow, she found that he had already milked Daisy, cleaned the milking pail, forked fresh hay to the cow and the hens, repaired the broken latch on the barn door that she had been meaning to fix for 6 weeks, and stacked the small pile of fence rails by the side of the barn into a neat, stable arrangement that would survive a winter wind. He was saddling the roan mare when she came in. "You did not need to do all of that," she said. "I know it," he said, cinching the saddle with the easy efficiency of long practice. "But you fed me and gave me a dry place to sleep, and that seemed to call for something in return." She looked at the repaired latch, running her thumb over the tight, clean work. "You do good work. I'm handy enough." She stood for a moment in the dim barn while the rain tapped steadily on the roof, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the particular pull of not wanting a person to leave. She dismissed this feeling immediately and thoroughly. "There's coffee on the stove if you want it before you go," she said. He looked at her for a moment over the back of the mare. "I wouldn't want to impose further." "It's already made," she said, and walked back to the house. He came in and drank the coffee standing at the kitchen counter, because she had not invited him to sit, and he had the sense to understand the distinction. They talked while the rain came down, tentatively at first, then with more ease, the way 2 people talk when they discover that the other person is more interesting than expected. He told her about the trail drives, about the vast flatness of the Texas plain, about the stars over the Llano Estacado that looked different from any other stars he had ever seen. She told him about Ohio, about her Uncle Franklin, about the way the Kansas soil had surprised her with its richness once she understood how to work with it instead of against it. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone more frightened, maybe, living out here alone." "Being frightened doesn't change the situation," she said. "And I have a 12-gauge shotgun behind the pantry door." He laughed. It was an unexpected laugh, genuine and full, and it changed his face entirely, lit it from the inside. Bessie looked at her coffee cup. "I should go," he said, though he did not move immediately. "Yes," she said, "you should." He was gone within the hour, riding south through the mud, and Bessie told herself that was that, and went about her day with a purposefulness that she would have recognized as overcorrection if she had been more willing to be honest with herself. Harvey Ellsworth was back 4 days later. He tied the roan mare at the hitching post and came to the front door this time, which was a statement in itself. He had shaved, and the cut above his eyebrow had begun to heal properly, and he held his hat in both hands the way a man does when he is about to say something that matters. "I rode south," he said, "and I thought about a number of things." "Did you?" she said. "The Cimarron ranch work didn't amount to much. Pay is poor and the outfit is rougher than I care for anymore." He paused. "But that's not the reason I came back." "What is the reason?" He met her eyes directly. "I don't rightly know how to explain it without sounding like a fool, but I kept thinking about this place, about the bread you make and the way the barn looks in the morning and the conversation we had." He paused again. "About you, if I'm being straight." Bessie held the door frame and looked at him. She was not a woman who was easily flustered, but she was aware of her heartbeat in a way she was not ordinarily aware of it. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said carefully, "I told you I was not running a boarding house." "Yes, ma'am, I remember that. I'm not looking for a boarding house." He turned his hat in his hands. "I was wondering if there was work around here, legitimate work. Your fence line to the east needs restringing. The barn roof has a section that won't make it through a hard winter. I noticed that corner post in the kitchen garden is rotted through at the base." She stared at him. "You are proposing to fix my property in exchange for fair wages, or if wages aren't available, for meals and a place to sleep in the barn." He said it plainly and without embarrassment. "Nothing improper. I just think there might be work here that needs doing, and I'm a man who needs work to do." Bessie was quiet for a long moment. She looked past him at the fence line, which was indeed sagging in 3 places. She looked at the barn roof, which was indeed beginning to curl at one corner. She looked back at Harvey Ellsworth, who was looking at her with those dark, patient eyes, and she made a decision that she would spend the next 4 decades being grateful for. "Room and board," she said. "In the barn. Breakfast at 6, supper at 6. Sundays you have to yourself. You touch one thing in this house that isn't yours and you're gone the same day." "Understood," he said. "And Mr. Ellsworth, this is a work arrangement, nothing more." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and put his hat back on, and there was that near smile again at the corner of his mouth, the one that she had been thinking about for 4 days and had not admitted to herself she had been thinking about. He was as good as his word, and better. The fence line to the east was restrung within the first week, the work done so cleanly and precisely that even old Mr. Hargrove at the general store commented on it when Bessie came in with her eggs. The barn roof was repaired with cedar shingles that Harvey sourced from a lumber yard in Wichita, riding the 20 miles up and back in a single day. The rotted corner post in the kitchen garden was replaced with a sound cedar post, and while he was at it, he re-leveled the entire garden frame, which Bessie had not asked him to do, and which made a considerable difference in how the water drained. He was quiet in the way that men are quiet when they are at peace with themselves, comfortable with silence, not needing to fill every space with noise. In the evenings after supper, he would sit on the porch steps and smoke a pipe, and sometimes Bessie would sit in the porch chair with her mending, and they would talk or not talk in equal measure. And she found that, Either way, his presence was something she had stopped thinking of as temporary without quite noticing when that had happened. They talked about everything and nothing. He told her about Missouri before the war, about the farm his family had kept, about his younger brother Daniel who had gone to California, and whose letters came once a year and were always full of extraordinary promises. She told him about her parents, both gone before she was 20, about the teacher in Ohio who had lent her books, and told her the world was larger than she suspected, about the particular loneliness of the first winter in Kansas when the wind came off the plain, and the silence was so complete it had a sound of its own. "Weren't you afraid coming out here alone?" he asked one evening in late October, the first frost just touching the grass silver at the edges. "Constantly," she said. "But my uncle needed somebody, and I had nothing tying me anywhere else. And it turns out fear is not the worst companion. It keeps you paying attention." He looked at her for a long moment in the gathering dark. "You are a remarkable woman, Bessie Redmond." She had been called remarkable before, usually by people who meant it as a synonym for peculiar. When Harvey said it, it sounded like something else entirely, like a statement of simple fact that he had arrived at through careful observation, and the difference between the two things hit her with a force she had not prepared for. "Don't be foolish," she said, and went inside. But she stood at the kitchen window for a while after, watching the orange tip of his pipe in the dark, and she thought about the word remarkable, and about the way he had said it, and about the fact that in a month she had come to understand a great deal about Harvey Ellsworth, and every piece of it was a piece she liked. November brought cold and wind, and with it came a problem. One of Bessie's egg customers, a rancher named Purvis Crane who ran cattle on 300 acres to the west, came by the house while Harvey was repairing the chicken coop, and made a point of standing very close to Bessie and speaking about the inconvenience of her having a ranch hand on the property, by which he actually meant, and everyone present understood he actually meant, that he had been nursing an interest in Bessie Redmond's land and her person for the better part of a year, and he did not appreciate the competition. Purvis Crane was 43, twice widowed, prosperous in the narrow and somewhat bullying way of a man who mistakes acreage for virtue. He had thick red hands and a loud voice, and the absolute conviction of a man who has never been seriously refused anything. Harvey came around the corner of the coop while this conversation was happening, having heard the tone of it through the thin wood, and he stood at a polite distance and said nothing, which was somehow more unsettling to Purvis Crane than any amount of confrontation would have been. "Is this your hired man?" Purvis asked Bessie, the word hired carrying a certain sneer. "Yes," she said. "And you think that's appropriate? A woman alone out here with a strange man working the property?" "I think my property is in considerably better condition than it was 2 months ago," she said, "and that is the only thing about my arrangements that concerns me." Purvis Crane looked at Harvey, who was leaning against the corner of the coop with his arms folded and a very steady, very neutral expression. Then he looked back at Bessie. "You're being foolish," he said. "Mr. Crane," she said pleasantly, "I sell you eggs at a fair price and I will continue to do so. That is the extent of our business relationship and the extent to which your opinion of my domestic situation is relevant. Good afternoon." After Crane had ridden off with the stiff back of a man who has been dismissed and knows it, Harvey was quiet for a moment. "He's going to make trouble," he said. "He already makes trouble," she said. "He's been making trouble since I got here. The question is whether the trouble is loud or quiet." She looked at Harvey. "He wanted this land when my uncle died. He wanted me to sell it to him. And you said no." "I said no." Harvey nodded slowly. "Well then," he said, and went back to repairing the coop. The trouble that Crane made turned out to be primarily of the loud variety, specifically the variety in which a man tells anyone who will listen, at the saloon and at the general store and after church, that Bessie Redmond is behaving in a manner that is unbecoming to a respectable woman. This was 1873 in Kansas, and the social arithmetic of the frontier was not always kind to women who made their own decisions without male supervision, and Bessie felt the shift in how certain people looked at her when she came into town. Mrs. Hargrove at the general store, who was a fair and practical woman, took Bessie aside one afternoon in December and told her straight out what was being said. "I know it isn't my business," Mrs. Hargrove said, "and I know you're a decent woman, Bessie, but people are talking, and in a town this size, talk has weight." "What exactly would make the talk stop?" Bessie asked. Mrs. Hargrove gave her a careful look. "That depends on what your intentions are, and his." Bessie went home and stood in her kitchen for a long time, looking at the table where Harvey ate his supper every evening, at the 2 cups on the shelf, at the small everyday evidence of a life that had quietly reorganized itself around a second person. Then she went to the barn. Harvey was brushing down the roan mare. The lantern threw warm light over the straw and the horse's flank and the lines of his face, and Bessie stood in the doorway and thought about all the things she had told herself this was not. "Harvey," she said. He turned. "People in town are saying things," she said, "about my reputation. Because of our arrangement." She held his gaze. "I am telling you this not because I want to change anything, but because you should know." He set down the brush. "What does Purvis Crane say specifically?" "That I am a woman of loose character," she said flatly. "That you are not a hired hand but something else." Harvey was quiet for a moment, something working behind his eyes. "Bessie," he said, and then he stopped, and then he started again. "I've been trying very hard not to say certain things, because I didn't want you to think I was here for any reason other than honest work. I wanted you to trust me before anything else." Her heart was going considerably faster than normal. "Say the certain things," she said. He crossed the barn in 3 steps and stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the line of the healed scar above his eyebrow, close enough that she could smell the cold night air on his coat. "I came back because I could not stop thinking about you," he said. "Not your land, not the work, you. The way you talk and the way you think and the way you looked at me that first morning like you were making a decision and you were going to stick to it." He paused. "I am in love with you, Bessie Redmond. I didn't plan it and I couldn't have stopped it, and I don't regret it, even if you send me down the road tomorrow morning." The silence in the barn was enormous and warm and full of the sound of the horse's quiet breathing. "You are not going down the road tomorrow morning," Bessie said, and her voice was not entirely steady, which was rare enough that it surprised her. "But I need you to understand something. I am not a woman who does things halfway. If this is something, it has to be a real thing, a proper thing. I will not have Purvis Crane or anyone else able to say something true and ugly about me." "I understand that completely," he said, "and I want exactly the same thing you want if you'll have me." She looked at him for a long moment, reading his face the way she had learned to read it over 2 months of careful attention, and she saw there what she had been seeing for a while and refusing to name. A man who was honest and patient and good, who had come off the trail and found something worth staying for and had stayed. "I'll have you," she said, "but you are going to have to court me properly. Which means you will have to move out of my barn and arrange legitimate accommodations in town, and you will come to call on Sunday afternoons, and you will speak to Reverend Alcott within the month." He smiled then, fully and completely, and it was such an unguarded, joyful smile that it took her breath away. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Harvey moved to a room above the Caldwell Feed and Grain, where the owner, a taciturn man named Brooks, rented 2 rooms to cowboys between drives. He was back at Bessie's property every morning at 6, working, and he stayed through supper, because she cooked for him and he ate at her table every evening, and they were both beginning to understand the shape of what they were building, though neither said so explicitly yet. He courted her with the same steady seriousness he brought to everything. He brought her things that were not flowery gestures but were useful and right. A book he had found at the dry goods in Wichita, one he thought she would enjoy, which she did. A paper of dried apple rings he had gotten from a woman at the church fair. A good quality oil lamp chimney to replace the cracked one in her sitting room. These were the gifts of a man paying attention, and Bessie, who had always found paying attention far more romantic than grand gestures, felt herself falling in love with every practical, thoughtful offering. He spoke to Reverend Alcott in early January of 1874, and Reverend Alcott, who was a man with more common sense than his somewhat stiff manner suggested, told Harvey that Bessie Redmond was one of the finest women in his congregation, and that he had better be certain of himself. "I am certain," Harvey said. "She is not an easy woman," the Reverend said. "She has views and she expresses them." "I know it," Harvey said. "That is part of what I am certain about." Harvey proposed to Bessie in February, on a Sunday afternoon, in the sitting room with the good oil lamp burning and snow coming down soft outside the window. He had not bought a ring, which he apologized for, and she told him she did not care about a ring. She cared about the man, and he looked at her with such plain gratitude that she thought she might cry, which was not a thing she did easily. She said yes before he had quite finished asking. They were married in April of 1874, when the Kansas prairie was just beginning to green up, and the wildflowers were pushing through the short grass in faint, extravagant waves of yellow and purple. The ceremony was in the small white church in Caldwell, and half the town came, and the other half had something pointed to say about it, which Bessie and Harvey regarded with equal serenity. Purvis Crane did not attend the wedding. He sold 300 acres to a cattle operation from Texas the following year and moved to Wichita, and Caldwell was improved by his absence, though no one said so publicly. Harvey and Bessie Ellsworth began their life together in the house on Franklin's 40 acres, and from the first week of their marriage, it was evident that they suited each other with the rare and particular rightness of two things made separately that fit together better than either fits alone. Harvey was a skilled cattleman, but he was also skilled at most things that required careful hands and patient attention, and the property expanded and improved steadily through his first years of work. He added a room to the house in the summer of 1874, a proper sitting room with windows on 2 walls, because Bessie liked light and he wanted to give her every room full of it. He built a proper tool shed, expanded the chicken coop, and began to inquire about buying the adjacent 40 acres to the north, which belonged to the estate of a man who had gone back east. Bessie managed the household and the kitchen garden and the laying hens with the organized competence that was native to her, but she also did more. She had a sharp head for numbers, sharper than Harvey's by his own cheerful admission, and she took over the record-keeping for the property with an efficiency that astonished him. "Where did you learn to do accounts?" he asked one evening, watching her enter figures in the ledger with neat, quick strokes. "My uncle taught me." He said a woman who couldn't read a ledger was a woman who would always be at the mercy of someone else's arithmetic. She glanced up. He was right. "He sounds like he was a sensible man." "He was a very good man," she said, and the small sadness in her voice was one Harvey recognized and did not press on. He came to understand her sorrows the way he came to understand everything about her, slowly and with great care, the way you learn a piece of country by walking it in every weather. She had a grief that she carried quietly, the grief of people lost too young, her parents, her uncle, the teacher from Ohio who had died of a chest complaint before Bessie was 15. She was not a woman who dwelt in that grief, but it was there, and Harvey thought that it had made her both more self-sufficient and more grateful for what she had, in a way that he found he both respected and loved. He had his own sorrows. His brother Daniel's letters from California had stopped coming by 1875, and no amount of inquiry produced any news of him, and Harvey lived with that uncertainty for years, the kind of grief that has no funeral and no proper ending, just the absence. He did not talk about it easily, but on a cold night in November of 1875, lying awake with Bessie's head on his shoulder, he told her about Daniel, about who he had been as a boy, about the way he had laughed, about the last letter that had been full of optimism about a mining scheme that probably had been the end of him. Bessie listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he was done, she put her hand on his chest over his heart and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and the weight of her hand and the fact of her presence beside him in the dark was more comfort than words would have been. Their first child was born in the spring of 1875, a boy they named Franklin after Bessie's uncle, with Harvey's dark eyes and Bessie's determined jaw, a combination that would serve him very well in life. Franklin was loud and curious and got into everything as soon as he could move independently, and Harvey watched Bessie with the baby with an expression that he was completely unguarded about, which was an expression of such transparent and uncomplicated love that it regularly reduced him to a uselessness that he was perfectly content with. Bessie found motherhood to be simultaneously harder and better than she had expected, which is the standard experience of motherhood, she concluded, regardless of the century. Harvey was not one of those frontier husbands who considered child-rearing entirely a woman's province. He fed Franklin his mashed sweet potato at supper, walked him in the dark hours of the night when he could not sleep, and developed a singing voice that nobody who knew him from the trail would have expected, low and slightly off-key, but completely sincere, with a repertoire that ranged from old Missouri folk songs to hymns that he had picked up from Reverend Alcott's Sunday services. By 1877, they had added a daughter named Clara, dark-haired and quiet and serious, in a way that suggested she was doing calculations about the world that she would reveal when she was ready. Clara and Franklin were devoted to each other in the particular way of siblings close in age who are best friends and rivals simultaneously, and the house was full of a noise and energy that Bessie sometimes stood back from, and looked at with a feeling that was close to disbelief at her own luck. Harvey bought the adjacent 40 acres in 1876, and with it came an old barn that he converted into a proper cattle operation. He was running a small herd of his own by 1878, nothing like the great trail drives of his youth, but a solid and productive little ranch that was entirely his and Bessie's, built from the ground up with their own labor and their own money and the careful arithmetic in Bessie's ledger. The town of Caldwell itself was changing around them. The cattle drives were bringing money and also bringing trouble, and the years around 1880 and 1881 were particularly rough, with the lawlessness that characterized the end of the Great Trail era pushing up against the efforts of the town's more settled residents to establish something permanent and orderly. There were shootings, there were disputes, there were the particular cruelties that come with a frontier economy in which certain people's rights were considered negotiable. Harvey and Bessie Ellsworth sat on the right side of most of those disputes. When the town tried to push out a family of exodusters, black homesteaders who had come to Kansas from the South seeking the freedom that had been promised and not entirely delivered after the war, Harvey stood up at a town meeting and said clearly, and on the record, that the Caldwell he intended to live in the rest of his life was going to be one in which a man's claim was as good as his labor, regardless of his color. He was not the only person to say so, but he said it with sufficient plainness that it was remembered. Bessie, for her part, had already been bringing baked goods to the exoduster settlement south of town for 2 months, because she had a talent for identifying what people needed and providing it without making them feel they were receiving charity. She taught the women in that settlement how to manage the Kansas soil, and they taught her things about greens and dried beans that she had not known, and the exchange was mutual in the way that the best kinds of exchange are. Their third child came in 1880, another boy they named James, who was from his first hours the most serene and agreeable human being Bessie had ever encountered, sleeping when he ought to sleep, eating without fuss, smiling early and often, as though he had arrived in the world having already made his peace with it. Harvey was 34 by then, and Bessie was 31, and they had been married 6 years, and the quality of their life together had continued to deepen and develop the way good things do when they are tended. They still talked on the porch in the evenings, Harvey with his pipe and Bessie with her mending or her book, and the conversation ranged further and more freely than it had in the beginning, because there is a particular freedom in knowing that you are understood and loved that makes ideas easier to voice. They argued sometimes, as people who are each strongly themselves will argue. Bessie had firm opinions about money, about the children's education, about whether the south fence line was worth the expense of replacing that winter, and she expressed these opinions without any of the softening self-effacement that was considered proper feminine discourse. Harvey had equally firm opinions about certain things, particularly cattle and horses and the specific technical management of the property, and he expressed his opinions without any pretense of deferring to anyone. These arguments were vigorous and occasionally loud, and always concluded without lasting injury, because they were both ultimately interested in the same things, which were the truth of the matter and the well-being of their family, and once either of those was established to satisfaction, they were each capable of yielding. Their fights did not have the cold, bitter quality of fights between people who are keeping score. They had the quality of two people working something out, which is what they were. The winter of 1881 was the hardest they had known. A blizzard came in early February that lasted 3 days, burying the cattle in the draws and filling the well with ice, and coming in under the door of the barn, so that the cow and the horses needed to be moved into the main barn with extra bedding. Harvey was outside for 16 hours of the first day, with Bessie bringing him coffee and warm food at the barn door, refusing to let him come in and warm himself because there was always one more thing that needed attending. She stood at the door on the second evening of the storm and saw him coming across the yard through the blowing white, bent into the wind, moving with the deliberate heavy walk of a man who has been using everything he has for too many hours, and the sight of him hit her with a love so fierce and physical it was almost indistinguishable from fear, because she understood completely in that moment how much she would lose if anything happened to him. When he came through the door, she took his frozen coat and did not say anything sentimental because that was not her way, but she poured his coffee and put her hand on the side of his face for a moment, her palm against his cold cheek, and he covered her hand with his and they stayed like that for a moment while the storm screamed outside. "We're going to be all right," he said. "I know," she said. "Go sit by the stove." They lost 7 head of cattle in that blizzard, and it set them back considerably in the ledger. But the spring that followed was excellent, and by fall they had recovered the loss and were running at a small profit again. Franklin, by 1883, was 8 years old and already working alongside Harvey with the seriousness and competence of a boy who has been watching carefully for years and is now ready to contribute. He had Harvey's ease with animals and Bessie's precision, and he could already read a horse's mood from 20 feet away. Clara was 6 and had a mathematical mind that Bessie was quietly determined would not go to waste regardless of what the frontier had to say about educating girls. James was 3 and had discovered that the world was full of interesting things to be touched and tasted and investigated, and keeping him alive and whole was a full-time occupation. The question of education was one that Bessie fought about with the energy of a woman who considers it non-negotiable. Caldwell had a school by this time, a single-room operation run by a young teacher from Illinois named Miss Townsend, who was well-meaning but overwhelmed. Bessie served on the school board, which was not a position women regularly held in 1883 Kansas, but she had gotten herself on it through a combination of political maneuvering and the simple fact that no one else wanted to do the work. And from that position, she lobbied relentlessly for better books, better heating, and better pay for Miss Townsend. Harvey supported all of this without reservation, and when Bessie came home from school board meetings fired up about some injustice or obstruction, he listened to the full account and added his own contributions, which were sometimes practical suggestions, and sometimes just the steady quiet of a man who believes in what his wife is doing. "You should run for something," he told her once, in 1884, after she had single-handedly reorganized the school board's entire approach to the reading curriculum. "Don't be absurd," she said. "I mean it. You are better at this than any of the men doing it." "I know I am," she said, "but that is not how things work right now." He looked at her with the expression that she knew meant he was thinking something he was going to say anyway. "It ought to be, though." "Yes," she said, "it ought to be." She smiled at him, sideways and warm. 20 years from now, maybe." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. 20 years from now," he said, "I'll be sitting right here watching you run for everything in sight." She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. They sat like that for a while, comfortable and quiet, while the children's voices came from the other end of the house, and the oil lamp threw its steady yellow circle over the table. Their fourth child came in 1886, a girl they named Ruth, who arrived in the world with red hair that astonished everyone and a temperament of such vivid willfulness that Bessie sometimes looked at her and recognized herself with a mixture of amusement and mild alarm. Harvey was 40 by then, and the years of outdoor work had written themselves on his face in the particular way they write on men who have spent their lives under an open sky. Lines at the corners of his eyes, a permanent deep weathering across his forehead, the kind of face that looked more complete and more interesting for the history written in it. Bessie was 37, and her honey-colored hair had a few threads of silver at the temples, and she wore them with the same equanimity that she brought to everything. They were still, unmistakably, people in love. This was something that their children would understand later, looking back, and that the people around them in Caldwell recognized as slightly exceptional. The particular quality of attention they paid each other, the way Harvey could make Bessie laugh with a single quiet word when no one else could find the entrance to her humor, the way Bessie could lay her hand on Harvey's arm in a crowded room and visibly settle something in him that had been unsettled. They did not make a display of it, because they were not people who made displays. It was simply present, quiet and enormous, in every ordinary thing they did together. The property had grown to nearly 300 acres by 1887, and Harvey was running a proper cattle operation. He had hired 2 ranch hands, men he had known from his trail days who had settled down and needed steady work, and the operation was prospering in a measured and careful way that reflected Bessie's influence on the financial management as much as Harvey's skill with the cattle. Franklin was 12 now and Clara 10, and James 7, and Ruth 1, and the house was loud and full and completely alive. Bessie had added a vegetable garden that supplied not only the family but a regular stand at the seasonal market in Caldwell, where she sold preserved goods and fresh produce, and the jars of honey from the hive of bees that Harvey had started keeping 3 years earlier, because he had read somewhere that they were good for the garden, and had simply gone and gotten a hive with the same quiet determination he brought to everything he decided to do. "You and your bees," Bessie said, the first fall he harvested honey, watching him carry in jar after jar of amber liquid, his face full of a quiet satisfaction. "You and your garden," he said, with that corner-of-the-mouth smile. "The garden feeds the family. The bees pollinate the garden," he said. "We are all connected." She rolled her eyes, but she was smiling, and she put up 16 jars of honey that winter and sold half of them for a price that considerably exceeded what she had expected. The 1880s were a complicated decade in Kansas. The cattle era that had made the trail towns roar was winding down, the open range being fenced and settled, and transformed into the kind of agricultural operation that required different skills and a different relationship with the land. Caldwell, which had been one of the wildest of the cattle towns, was in the process of becoming a proper settled community, with all the respectability and all the limitations that accompanied that transition. Harvey and Bessie Ellsworth occupied a position in that transitioning community that was anchored by respect and by years of demonstrated reliability. Harvey was on the county livestock board by 1888, a position that required both his practical expertise and the particular quality of fairness that he had always brought to disputes. He was the kind of man that other men brought their disagreements to, because he was known to listen to both sides and to say what he actually thought, which was rarer than it should have been. Bessie was teaching at the school by then formally, because Miss Townsend had married and moved to Wichita, and the school had been without a qualified teacher for most of a semester. Bessie had stepped in initially as a temporary measure, and had stayed because she was better at it than anyone else available, and because the children in Caldwell deserved a teacher who knew what she was doing and was not intimidated by their needs. She taught every grade in the single room, which was how frontier schools operated, the older children helping to teach the younger ones while the teacher worked with each group in turn. She was demanding and clear and consistent, and her students did better on the state assessments that began to be administered in the late 1880s than students from schools in much larger towns, which caused some comment and some considerable pride. Harvey, asked once what he thought of his wife teaching school while running a household and managing the books for the ranch, said that he thought it was fine and sensible, because Bessie was capable of more than most people understood, and it had never been his intention to limit her to less than the full extent of what she could do. He said this so plainly, and without any apparent sense that it was a remarkable thing to say that the man who had asked him, a rancher from north of town with more traditional ideas about women, was left slightly at a loss. Franklin finished school in 1889 and went to work full-time on the ranch, which was what he had always intended, and he and Harvey worked together with the ease of men who have spent years learning each other's rhythms. Franklin was 14 and already nearly as tall as his father and considerably broader across the shoulders, a young man who was going to be substantial in every sense of the word. Clara, at 12, was clearly headed somewhere beyond the ranch, and Bessie was writing letters to the women's college in Lawrence with a determination that Clara thought was excessive, and that Bessie considered to be barely adequate. The idea that her daughter's exceptional mind might not have the education it deserved was not something Bessie Ellsworth was prepared to accept. "You worry too much about me," Clara told her mother one evening, with the slightly exasperated affection that 12-year-old daughters specialize in. "I worry about exactly the right amount," Bessie said, adding a figure to the college correspondence ledger. "Papa doesn't worry." "Your father trusts me to do the worrying," Bessie said, which is its own form of wisdom. Harvey, who had been listening from behind his newspaper, lowered it slightly and gave Clara a look that said clearly this was, in fact, exactly the dynamic in operation, and that he had no complaints about it. James, at 9, had developed a passion for horses that eclipsed even Franklin's considerable feeling for the animals, and he spent every available hour in the barn. Harvey taught him everything he knew, because Harvey's own feeling for horses was the deepest and most constant thing about him, the through line from his trail driving days to his ranching life, and passing that knowledge to James felt to him like the transmission of something that mattered. Ruth, at 3, was a force of nature in red pigtails who had opinions about everything, and expressed them continuously and at high volume, and who had her father completely wrapped around her small imperious finger, a fact she was already entirely aware of, and using to considerable advantage. The year 1890 brought a drought that hit Kansas with unusual severity, burning the grass brown by June and cracking the earth in the fields into the puzzle patterns that meant real trouble for the crops. Harvey and Bessie had been through hard years before, and they managed this one with the careful attention and the willingness to adjust that characterized everything they did. Harvey cut the herd by 30 head early, before the prices dropped further, which was the right decision, and one that not everyone made in time. Bessie stretched the household budget with a precision that was almost artful, finding ways to feed 4 children and 2 ranch hands, and sustain a household through a bad season without causing anyone to feel the pinch more than they needed to. They sat on the porch in the hot, dusty evenings of that drought summer, and the conversation was quieter and more careful than usual. But it was still there, still the thread that connected them to each other over the long heat and the worry. "We're going to be all right," she said one evening in August, the way he usually said it, and he looked at her with something that was not quite surprise and not quite gratitude but contained elements of both. "Yes," he said, "we are. The well is holding and the cattle we kept are holding and the kitchen garden is still producing because I am watering it by hand every morning and the children are healthy." She said this as if reviewing a list of established facts. Everything else is adjustable. He reached over in the dark and took her hand, and she let him hold it while they sat and watched the lightless sky and listened to the dry wind move through the grass. The drought broke in September, and the fall that followed was one of the most beautiful Bessie had ever seen, as if the land were making amends, the sky going deep blue and the remaining grass going gold and the air turning crisp and clean after the long heat. Franklin married in 1893, a girl from a settled family to the north named Grace Winters, who was steady and good-humored and made Franklin, who had a tendency towards seriousness, considerably more cheerful. Harvey and Bessie welcomed her to the family with genuine warmth, and Bessie taught her everything she knew about managing a household and a kitchen garden and keeping accounts, because Grace was sharp and willing, and Bessie had never been a woman who held knowledge close when there was someone good to give it to. Clara did go to the women's college in Lawrence. She went in 1893, at 16, and she went with a trunk full of books that Bessie had been assembling for years and a head full of mathematics, and a quiet determination that Bessie recognized as purely her own reflection back at her. The day they put Clara on the train, Harvey stood on the Caldwell platform with his hat in his hands and looked at his daughter through the train window with an expression of such open, uncomplicated pride that Bessie had to look away for a moment because it undid her. "She is going to do extraordinary things," Harvey said. "I know it," Bessie said, and took his arm, and they stood together on the platform until the train was gone from sight. James, at 13, had grown into a young man of unusual calm and competence with horses, and Harvey had started him breaking yearlings with the kind of confidence a father shows when he already knows the outcome. James had a gift that went beyond training. He seemed to understand horses at some level below language, to communicate with them through something other than instruction, and watching him work with a frightened or difficult animal was something even the experienced ranch hands would stop to watch. Ruth at 7 was at school and running it, as far as anyone could tell. She had Bessie's brain and Harvey's stubbornness, and the red hair that belonged to some ancestor neither of them could account for, and she was going to be, as Harvey remarked with great affection, a considerable problem and a great joy. The last decade of the 19th century moved through the Ellsworth property with the rhythm of years well lived. There were good seasons and difficult ones. There was the ordinary drama of a family growing and changing. There were losses and gains, and the gradual physical evidence of time passing in the gray that crept through Harvey's hair, and the deepening of the lines around Bessie's eyes, and the quiet, comfortable way their bodies had learned to exist in the same space after 20 years of daily proximity. They danced at Franklin's harvest celebration in 1895, which their son and his wife Grace threw in the newly expanded barn with paper lanterns and a fiddle player from Wichita and every neighbor within 10 miles. Harvey danced with Bessie and then with Grace and then with Ruth, who was 9 and took the dancing seriously, and then he came back to Bessie and danced with her again because she was the one he wanted to dance with. She felt his hand at the small of her back and his other hand holding hers, and they moved through the familiar figures of the dance with the particular ease of two people who have been dancing together long enough that they no longer need to think about it, and she thought, "This is my life. This specifically is my life, this man and this dance and this family and this lit-up barn." And the thought of it was so large and so good that she pressed slightly closer to him, and he looked down at her, and the barn and the music and everything else went slightly dim for a moment. "What are you thinking about?" he said low, close to her ear. "How lucky I am," she said. He pulled her a little closer. "I think about that every single day," he said. Franklin and Grace had a son in 1896, a boy they named Harvey in a gesture that completely undid the elder Harvey and left him standing in the yard for 20 minutes unable to speak properly. Bessie watched him hold his grandson for the first time and thought that the expression on his face was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, which was saying something, considering the quantity of beautiful things she had seen in 22 years of sharing a life with him. Clara came home from Lawrence in 1897 with a teaching certificate and a quiet purpose, and a young man named William Hale, who was a surveyor and a person of excellent character and considerable intelligence, and who had clearly understood very quickly that Clara Ellsworth was one of the most remarkable people he was likely to encounter in his life. Harvey and Bessie liked him within the first evening, which was not something that happened automatically with either of them. James, at 17, was managing the horse breeding operation on the ranch with a skill that was drawing attention from buyers as far away as Missouri, and Harvey had begun to think seriously about expanding that side of the business, because James's instinct for quality was extraordinary, and the market for good working horses was consistent and reliable. Ruth was 11 and had decided she wanted to be a lawyer, which was a statement that caused Reverend Alcott, who had come for Sunday supper, to clear his throat significantly, and which Harvey received with complete seriousness, asking her what she knew about the law so far and what she thought she needed to learn, which was the right question, and the one that sent Ruth away from the table in a state of determined focus. After Reverend Alcott left that Sunday, Harvey and Bessie sat over the remains of supper and looked at each other in the comfortable conspiratorial way of parents who have just managed something together. "Do you think she will do it?" Harvey asked. "I think she will do whatever she decides to do," Bessie said. "She is relentless." "She gets that from her mother," Bessie smiled. "She gets everything good from both of us," she said. "And the stubbornness is pure Ellsworth, I want to be clear about that." He laughed and reached across the table, and she gave him her hand. The year 1900 came with the feeling of a threshold being crossed, a new century turning over with its promises and its uncertainties. Harvey was 54 and Bessie 51, and they were healthy and active and not given to feeling old, though Bessie noted that Harvey took longer to get up from low positions than he once had, and that Harvey noticed Bessie wore her reading glasses more consistently than she used to, and that neither of them mentioned these things because they were both perfectly aware of them and no commentary was required. Clara married William Hale in the spring of 1900, in the same Caldwell church where Bessie and Harvey had been married 26 years earlier. Bessie stood in the church and looked at her daughter in the white dress and then at Harvey beside her, and he leaned down and said quietly, "We did that," meaning Clara, meaning the whole assembled fact of their daughter, and Bessie felt the truth of it settle in her chest with a richness that was almost too much. James, at 20, was by now running the horse breeding operation almost entirely on his own, and he had built it into something genuinely impressive. He had a keen eye for bloodlines and conformation, and the patience to wait for the right animals and the right buyers, and the Ellsworth horses were known for 30 miles in every direction as the best working stock in the county. He fell in love, in the easy, unassuming way of people who are themselves easy and unassuming, with a woman named Ellen Marsh, the daughter of a wheat farmer from the eastern edge of the county, who was 20, steady, and completely crazy about horses, which cemented everything. Harvey and Bessie went to the Marsh farm for Sunday dinner to meet Ellen's family, and on the drive home in the wagon, Harvey said he liked both Ellen and her parents and thought the match was sound, and Bessie said she agreed and that Ellen had good hands with horses, which was her own form of the highest praise. Ruth, at 14, was the most formidably educated person in the Caldwell school, which she had somewhat outgrown, and Bessie was writing letters to the women's college in Lawrence again with the same determination that had gotten Clara there, and with the additional ammunition of Clara's success to cite as evidence of what the investment produced. The first decade of the new century moved with a fullness that the Ellsworth household had no trouble filling. Franklin and Grace had 3 more children. Clara and William lived in Lawrence, where Clara was teaching at the same college she had attended and was, by all evidence, doing exactly the extraordinary things Harvey had predicted at the train station. James and Ellen married in 1903, and their first child, a boy, was born in 1904 to everyone's great delight. Ruth went to Lawrence in 1904, at 18, with the same determination Clara had shown and with a clearer specific purpose. She was going to study law whether the law wanted to be studied by a red-haired woman from Kansas or not. The women's suffrage movement was building, and the conversations happening in the country were beginning to catch up with ideas that Bessie had been expressing at her kitchen table and at school board meetings for 30 years. And Ruth Ellsworth arrived at her education with the complete confidence of a woman who has been told her whole life by both parents that she was capable of whatever she decided to attempt. Harvey and Bessie were alone together in the house for the first time since 1875, and they found, to the mild surprise of neither of them, that they suited each other absolutely as much in this new quiet configuration as they had in the full loud version of the family. They had more time for the conversations on the porch, more time for the evenings with books, more time for the unhurried morning hours over coffee when the best conversations always happened. They had 40 years of shared experience to talk about and no shortage of opinions about any of it, and the talk was still interesting, still surprising, still capable of going places that neither of them had expected. Harvey could still make her laugh with one quiet word. She could still read his mood from across a room. The specific attentive love between them had not diminished with familiarity. It had deepened, the way a river deepens as it moves through country and gathers more of what feeds it. They walked the property in the evenings that fall, the two of them, the 300 acres that had been 40 when they started, and Harvey pointed out things he was planning and things he was pleased with and things he thought needed attention, and Bessie listened and contributed and argued where she disagreed, which was the same conversation they had always had, still alive and still productive after 30 years. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked him one evening on the far side of the north field where the grass was long and the sky was enormous overhead, coming back that October, choosing this. He stopped walking and looked at her with an expression that she had never once in 30 years seen him aim in any other direction. "Every good thing in my life," he said, "has come from sitting down on your porch that morning, every single one of them." She looked out at the long grass and the enormous Kansas sky and the far smoke of the house chimney against the late light. "I was going to cook for you once," she said. "Just that once." He laughed, and it was still that same laugh she had first heard in her kitchen 31 years ago, full and genuine and lit from the inside. "Yes," he said, "I know that's what you were going to do." She looked at him sideways. "You knew I would change my mind." "I didn't know anything," he said. "I just knew I would come back." "Why?" He considered it seriously, the way he considered everything, giving it the full weight of his attention. "Because the bread was the finest thing I had ever eaten," he said, "and because the woman who made it was the finest person I had ever talked to. And I thought if I could just get back to that kitchen and that table, I would figure out the rest." She took his arm, and they stood in the long grass with the October sky going gold and rose above them, and the distance between who they had been and who they had become was enormous and tender, and full of everything that mattered. "Come on, old cowboy," she said. "Supper's going to burn." "Is it the bread?" he asked hopefully. "It is the bread," she said. He smiled at her, that full and unguarded smile, and they walked home together through the gold evening. The years from 1910 onward were the years of fullness and harvest in all the senses that matter. The children were grown and established in their lives, and the grandchildren were beginning to arrive in numbers that required a second ledger page to track. Clara and William had two daughters who were serious and book-mad, and appeared destined for academic lives. Franklin and Grace had 4 children now, ranging from young Harvey, who was 14 and already clearly a ranching man, to the youngest, a girl called May, who was 4 and spent most of her time following Bessie around the kitchen with the focused intensity of a young person in the presence of a master. James and Ellen had 3 children, all of them horse-mad, and the horse breeding operation that James ran was by 1910, one of the most respected small operations in the state, supplying working horses to ranches as far as Colorado and shipping quality stock to buyers in Missouri and Iowa. Harvey had formally handed over the management of the ranch side of the operation to Franklin in 1908, not because he was too old to run it, but because Franklin was ready, and because Harvey had other things he wanted to do with his time, including fishing, which he had discovered late and taken to with great enthusiasm, and including being the grandfather he had always suspected he was going to be very good at. He was very good at it. He sat on the porch with grandchildren in his lap and told them stories about the trail drives, about the great cattle herds coming north from Texas through the Indian Territory, about the nights on the Llano Estacado with the stars so thick and close you could almost touch them. He taught them to fish in the creek at the far edge of the property. He taught them the names of the birds and the grasses and the cloud formations, knowledge accumulated over 50 years of paying attention to the Kansas sky. He was patient in the way that only comes from having been impatient and having learned better, and the grandchildren adored him with the pure, uncomplicated adoration that grandchildren offer to grandparents who have nothing left to prove and nothing to do but love them. Bessie was the same. She was teaching the grandchildren to cook, beginning with the bread that had started everything, because it seemed appropriate. Young May, Franklin's youngest, had genuine talent and genuine interest, and Bessie spent hours with her at the kitchen table, guiding small hands through the process of kneading and forming and waiting that good bread requires. She taught her the way her own uncle had once tried to teach her the value of paying attention to the specifics, because the difference between good bread and excellent bread was in the details, and the difference between a good life and an excellent life was the same. Ruth qualified as a lawyer in 1912, which was a fact of such monumental satisfaction to Bessie that she kept the letter of notification in the kitchen for 3 weeks before Harvey gently moved it to the sitting room bookshelf, where it could be preserved properly. Ruth was not the first woman lawyer in Kansas, but she was among the early ones, and she established a practice in Wichita that dealt primarily with land and inheritance disputes, which were endemic in that country, and at which she was formidably good. When she came home for Christmas in 1912 and described her first significant case, which she had won against a large and well-funded opposition, Harvey sat at the kitchen table and listened to every detail with his elbows on the table and his chin in his hand, and the expression of a man in the presence of something wonderful. "Ruth," he said when she finished. "Yes, Papa." "Your mother knew you could do all of this when you were 11 years old," he said. "Did you know that?" Ruth looked at Bessie. Bessie was at the stove, not looking at either of them. "I hoped," Bessie said without turning around. "I always hope, and then I help." Ruth got up and hugged her mother from behind, and Bessie let herself be hugged for a moment with the small, contained smile of a woman who has been right about a thing she cared about deeply. Harvey, watching from the table, felt the familiar, enormous quality of his love for his wife, which had the particular characteristic, after 40 years, of being both utterly familiar and still capable of surprising him with its depth. He thought about a rainy October morning and a porch post, and a smell of bread through an open window, and about the decision that this woman had made that had changed his life entirely, and he was grateful for it with every part of himself. The winter of 1913 was gentle, and they had a good holiday season, with most of the family at the house for Christmas, the grandchildren running through the rooms and the smell of Bessie's cooking filling the house from early morning, and Harvey sitting in his chair by the fire with young Harvey on one knee and May on the other, telling a story about a cattle drive in the winter of 1870 that grew more elaborate with each retelling, and which all the grandchildren knew by heart and still demanded to hear. James and Ellen brought news that they were expecting their fourth child. Franklin and Grace announced they were planning to add a room to their own house on the north part of the property, which meant the family was spreading properly into the land. Clara wrote from Lawrence that William had been offered a teaching position at the university, and that she was being asked to take over the head of the mathematics department, which she intended to accept. Bessie read Clara's letter to Harvey over coffee on a January morning, the light coming low and gold through the kitchen window the way it does in winter when it gets in under the clouds and illuminates everything with a particular specific warmth. "Head of the mathematics department," Harvey said. "Yes." Our Clara, Bessie agreed. He looked at her across the table with 40 years of marriage and 4 children and more joy than he had ever known how to properly account for written in his face. "I have thought often," he said slowly, "about what my life would have been if I hadn't stopped at your porch that morning. Where would you have gone? South, the Cimarron Ranch, or through to New Mexico probably, following the work?" She nodded. "And instead I came back," he said. "Because you fed me once and I could not think about anything else." She smiled. "The bread," she said. "Not just the bread," he said. "Never just the bread." She reached across the table and he took her hand, and they sat in the winter morning light with the sound of the house around them, the particular living silence of a place that has been deeply inhabited, that holds inside its walls the accumulated weight of everything that has happened there. The years from 1913 to 1913's end carried them through the ordinary richness of what a well-built life produces. More grandchildren, more seasons, the continuing daily conversation between two people who have never run out of things to say to each other. Harvey kept his bees and his fishing and his grandchildren. Bessie kept her kitchen and her books and her garden and her careful attention to everything that mattered. There were harder days within those years, as there are in any life honestly lived. Harvey had a bad winter with his lungs in 1914, a deep chest cold that went on too long and left him weaker than he liked, and Bessie handled the fear of those weeks with the same composed practicality she had brought to every difficulty, keeping him warm and fed and bullied into rest, sitting with him in the long evenings and reading aloud from the books she chose with care, because she knew which ones he liked best. He recovered fully by spring, and came back to himself with the intact patience of a man who has been ill and is genuinely glad to be on the other side of it. She had her own moment in 1917, a year when the war in Europe was reaching into the lives of even the most remote American communities, and Franklin and Grace's oldest son, young Harvey, turned 18 and was eligible for the draft that the country had instituted that spring. The fear that had been resident in Bessie's chest for months crystallized into something acute, and she and Harvey stayed up very late one night talking about it, about the war and about young Harvey, and about the things you can control and the things you cannot. "He is like you," Bessie said. "He will be all right because he pays attention." "That's not always enough," Harvey said. "I know it," she said, "but it is what we have." Young Harvey Ellsworth shipped out that fall with the American Expeditionary Forces and came back in 1919, intact and permanently changed in the ways that war changes young men, which is to say more serious and more grateful and less willing to take ordinary good days for granted, which his grandfather Harvey Ellsworth recognized entirely and received with a particular quiet understanding that passed between the two of them in a way that did not require words. The summer of 1919, when young Harvey came home, was a summer of celebration at the ranch. Bessie cooked for 2 days straight in preparation for the homecoming dinner, and the table that Harvey had built to replace the original kitchen table in 1890 held 14 people that evening, which required the addition of the pine board extension that had been kept in the barn for exactly such occasions. Franklin and Grace, James and Ellen, Clara and William, who had driven down from Lawrence for the occasion, Ruth, who had taken the train from Wichita, young Harvey and his parents and his siblings and his cousins, and at the head of the table, Harvey Ellsworth at 63 and Bessie Ellsworth at 60, looking down the length of the table at the people they had made and the people those people had made, and the noise and the food and the warmth and the late summer light through the windows. Harvey raised his glass, which contained the good whiskey he kept for occasions of real importance, and he looked at Bessie first before he looked at anyone else, and the look contained everything. 45 years from a rainy porch to this overflowing table. To family, he said. To family, everyone said. And the years continued, rich and full and well counted. Harvey Ellsworth turned 70 in 1916, which they had celebrated with enormous enthusiasm, and the celebration was repeated with compound interest when he turned 75 in 1921, with more grandchildren present than could be easily counted, and Ruth making a speech that was both funny and moving, and that had Harvey laughing, and then clearing his throat in the way he did when he was affected by something, and preferred to manage it quietly. He was still himself at 75. The body moved slower, the lungs were not what they were, and he tired more easily than he had in the days when he could work 16 hours on a blizzard fence line and still walk steadily. But the mind was entirely intact, and the eyes were still dark and direct, and the near smile was still there at the corner of his mouth, and he was still the man who had come back to a rainy farmyard in October of 1873, because he could not stop thinking about a woman who had told him she would cook for him once and not make a habit of it. Bessie had long since stopped thinking about the fact that she had made a habit of it. The table that held Harvey Ellsworth's supper every evening for 48 years now also held grandchildren and neighbors and ranch hands, and the occasional stranger who needed a meal, because she was constitutionally incapable of passing up a person who needed feeding, and she had never stopped being generous with her table. Harvey ate at it every night, still, rain or clear, summer or winter, the two of them at the ends of the big table or just at the near corner of it when they were alone, talking over the day with the unhurried ease of people who know they have time and also know, at some level, that time is not infinite and should be used carefully. The autumn of 1913 had a quality of gold that Bessie could still call up precisely when she tried, and the autumn of every year after that had some of the same quality, not always. But when the light came in at the right angle and the air had the particular crisp warmth of a Kansas October afternoon, she was back in the first of all those autumns, young and sharp and slightly afraid and completely alive, watching a dusty cowboy put his hat back on and say, "Yes, ma'am." She told him this on a Sunday afternoon in 1921, sitting on the porch that had been rebuilt twice since 1873, but occupied the same exact position it always had, on the same land, with the same sky overhead. The grandchildren were somewhere in the middle distance being supervised by Franklin and Grace, and the older grandchildren, young Harvey among them, were working the south fence line in a way that was visible from the porch as small industrious shapes against the long afternoon light. "I think about that morning sometimes," she said. "The first one, the rain." Harvey was in his chair with his pipe, the one concession to habit he had kept through 50 years. "The bread," he said. "You and that bread," she said. "It was very good bread," he said. "It is the same bread I have made every week for 50 years. And it has never been anything other than excellent," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the horizon, at the long flat gold distance that was as much a part of him as anything. The man who had been raised on Missouri farmland and shaped by Texas trail drives and settled at last into this Kansas country that he knew the way you know a person you have lived with completely, every mood of it, every season, every particular quality of light. "Harvey," she said. He turned to look at her. "I would do it again," she said. "Every bit of it. I would open the door every time." He held her gaze for a moment, and the long quiet was not empty but full. Full of every morning they had woken in the same bed, and every supper they had eaten at the same table, and every conversation they had had, and every moment of difficulty they had come through together, and every grandchild who had sat in their laps, and every season that had turned over the Kansas sky above their heads. "So would I," he said. "Every single time." She reached over and took his hand, and he held it the way he always had, securely and without ceremony, and they sat on the porch in the gold afternoon, while the grandchildren worked the fence line in the distance, and the light moved slowly across the grass, and the October sky went blue to rose to the first deep purple of evening. Bessie Redmond had said she would cook for the cowboy just once. He ate at her table every night for 40 years, and then the years after that too, right up until the last good evening of their long and well-made life, with the whole enormous family they had built together gathered around the table she had set, and the bread she had made, and the man at the other end of it still looking at her with the same dark, patient eyes that had looked up from her porch railing on a rainy October morning so many years before and found, by some extraordinary luck, exactly where they needed to be. The end came for Harvey on a January morning in 1923, quiet and without significant struggle, in the bed they had shared for 49 years, with Bessie beside him and the winter light coming through the windows they had chosen together, and all 4 children present in the house and the sound of grandchildren somewhere below. It was the kind of ending that a good long life sometimes produces, a closing rather than a cutting off, and Bessie received it with the same composed and unbreakable love that she had brought to everything in their life together. She buried him on the hill at the east edge of the property, under the cottonwood tree that had been a sapling when they first walked that land together in 1874. The whole family came. Clara read a passage from a book Harvey had loved. Ruth spoke briefly, and with a precision and feeling that left everyone quiet. Franklin and James and young Harvey stood together at the graveside with the particular posture of men who are holding themselves very straight because it is necessary. Bessie stood at the grave in the January cold and looked at the coffin of the man who had sat down on her porch railing 50 years ago, and she said quietly, to herself and to him, and to whatever continued after the body was put in the earth, that she had loved him every day they had known each other, and that she intended to love him every day that remained to her, which was the sort of promise she always kept. She lived another 9 years, years that were full in their own right, with grandchildren and great-grandchildren and Ruth's career reaching its full expression and Clara's academic work being recognized in ways that would have seemed impossible when they were writing letters to Lawrence from a kitchen table in Caldwell, Kansas. Bessie kept her garden and her bees and her kitchen and her bread, and the table in her kitchen was always full because she had never learned any other way to keep a table, and every evening she set 2 cups on the shelf out of a habit of 50 years, and every evening she looked at the second cup for a moment before she took it down again, and she was not sad exactly, or not only sad, because sadness was too simple a word for what it was to have had something so large and so good and to live every day in its long and grateful aftermath. Young May, Franklin's daughter, who had learned to bake bread at Bessie's kitchen table as a small child, was married and had children of her own by 1930, and she brought her own daughter to Bessie's kitchen in the last summer of Bessie's life, and Bessie sat at the table and guided 2 small hands through the kneading and forming and waiting, the same process she had been practicing since before the girl's great-grandmother was born, and the bread that came out of the oven had the same quality it had always had. The quality of being made with attention and love, and the knowledge that a good thing is worth doing correctly. "Grandmother," May's daughter asked, with the directness of small children, "why do you always make bread?" Bessie looked at the loaf on the cooling rack and thought about a rainy October morning and a starving, dusty cowboy, and a life that had been the best surprise of her existence. "Because bread is the beginning of everything," she said. "And because once you make it for someone, they come back for more, and that is the best possible thing that can happen." The child considered this. "Did someone come back for more of your bread?" Bessie smiled, the full, warm smile that the family had always known as the expression she reserved for the things she loved most. "Every night," she said. "For 40 years and more." The Kansas autumn moved through the windows of the old house on the property that had grown from 40 acres to nearly 400, the land that two people had built from a leaky barn and a kitchen garden and a table set for one. And the light fell the way it had always fallen in October, gold and long and gentle, over everything they had made and everything that would continue. Bessie Ellsworth died in the spring of 1932, in the same house she had inherited from her Uncle Franklin 60 years before, in the same bed she had shared with Harvey for 49 years, in the same Kansas that had surprised her with its richness once she understood how to work with it. Clara and Ruth and Franklin and James were with her, and the grandchildren were in the house, and the bread was in the oven because May had made it that morning, the same bread, the right bread, the bread that had started everything. They buried her beside Harvey on the hill under the cottonwood tree, and the family stood together in the spring morning, 4 children and their spouses and more grandchildren than the hill could easily hold, and the sky was the enormous Kansas blue that Bessie had described to a young Missouri cowboy on a rainy morning half a century before, telling him about the way the Kansas soil had surprised her with its richness. On the headstone they put her name and her dates, and below them, because Ruth had insisted, and because every other person present had immediately agreed, a single line that was both exactly right and completely insufficient to contain what it was describing. She set the table and he came to it, and between them they built a world. The cottonwood above the graves threw its spinning seeds into the warm April air, and they drifted out over the greening grass and the long flat country and the property that carried their name forward into all the years that followed. And the spring light that had always been generous with that piece of Kansas was generous still, falling on everything equally, the way good light always does.